Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about seeking romantic partners when you have ADHD and whether there's assortative mating or not. So I'll start with the take-home message, then I will move on to the body of the talk, which will be probably 20 minutes or less, and then I'll be open to questions, whether they're relative to this topic or not, so that the eventual video may be considerably longer. Again, if you're just looking to hear the talk itself is not going to stretch out too terribly long. So the take-home message is, assortative mating means that like marries like. So people seek out traits in their partner that are similar to traits in themselves. So this would imply people with ADHD have a greater tendency to marry other people with ADHD. Now we know assortative mating occurs in the animal kingdom. Certainly, we've known for at least 120 years, verifiably, that assortative mating occurs in humans for physical traits such as height. It occurs also for social traits like income, religion, and race. And there's at least 3 decades of evidence that psychological traits such as mental health conditions are also people assortatively mate seek out other people with their condition. There's lots of people who do couples counseling with ADHD individuals or who work in ADHD clinics who are convinced that there's both assortative and disassortative mating. So disassortative mating is when you are choosing someone with opposite traits. So someone with ADHD who may feel disorganized or needing structure or environment chooses a partner who's not particularly spontaneous, who plans a lot, who overschedules things, who regulates and maintains sort of the status quo and pays the bills. So on the surface, it would seem that's contradictory, whether people with ADHD are looking for themselves or looking for the opposite. I think the data is extremely meager. There's a little data for 1 or 2 studies suggest there is some assortative mating going on, and actually that it is stronger in ADHD than it is for depression or anxiety. There's also some even less extensive data suggesting disassortative mating occurs. So again, why that's important is that it's saying there may be 2 general patterns, and there's certainly many people who don't fit either pattern or somewhere in the middle. But if there's a preponderance, then it's important to know because it has predictive values for the health of the relationship, for the health of the individuals, and the health of any children they might have. So, and part of the whole value of a diagnosis such as ADHD is helping to understand yourself, helping to predict what's likely to happen if you don't treat it, and to select treatments that are appropriate. And if there are relationship issues that are pertinent to that, then again, those don't have to apply to every single individual, just like we know people with ADHD are about twice as likely as the general population to commit suicide. That does not mean everyone who has ADHD is at a suicide risk, but it's important to be aware of that and helping protect against impulsive actions. So that's a take-home message. Jumping into assortative mating. So Carl Pearson, who's sort of thought of as the father of statistics, particularly biological statistics, way back in 1903 published a study looking at assortative mating in humans, and it was based on body size, so several different measurements, including the length of your ulnar bone. Men with longer ulnas tended to marry women with longer ulnas, and several other body measurements correlated this way. So we know that in humans, well, in animals, the most widely studied types of assortative mating are on body size and on body coloration. So in some species, there's different color morphs or forms. Those tend to be more likely to pick their same color when they're mating together. And it's interesting that the biological research is focused so much on size and color, and it suggests maybe a limitation in our human thoughts is that we don't even know what makes a bird attractive to another bird. We look at variables that we can measure and that we think are important, and we may be missing other important variables where assortative mating is happening. So in humans, again, genetic variables variables that are physical and under genetic control, like body height, other physical attributes. There's assortative mating that's been documented. There's also clearly assortative mating on social variables, so particularly socioeconomic income rates. The rich tend to marry the rich and the poor. That's certainly not an absolute. It certainly varies a little bit how strongly that correlation is across generations, but it's been there for decades. There's also a social assortative mating across ethnic and racial lines, across religious beliefs. Some theoreticians think that most of these social assortative matings is because that's who you're hanging out with and socially stratified, and it's not particularly selecting people from your particular group. It's who you are more likely to be lumped with or run across in daily life. There's also been some studies on psychological assortative mating, and going back at least 20 years ago, there was enough data to do a meta-analysis looking at affective disorders, so depression, bipolar disorder, and assortative mating was more strong factor appeared to be for people with bipolar disorder than for depression, but it was observable or measurable with those just in depression. So the theory or the claims behind why people with ADHD might show assortative mating is that, and some of this is backed up by evidence. So the evidence is that in childhood, kids with ADHD are recognized as being different by their peers, by their parents, by teachers, adults, other individuals, and very often are stigmatized, treated as outcasts, treated as different. There are other studies showing that social skills, or at least the ability to apply social skills in the minute or in the moment, are more likely to be problematic in kids with ADHD than their non-ADHD peers. And again, that leads to these kids with ADHD being social outcasts, and that they learn that their tribe, their family, who's going to support them, who's going to be there for them, who's not going to diss them, are their fellow individuals with ADHD. So that's why they wind up marrying people with ADHD. So we'll jump into what the data is really meager. So there was a study published 2 years ago, 2022, done by researchers at Ohio State and University of Pennsylvania, and they recruited online. They've had 70 individuals with ADHD and 94 controls. Controls were matched with regard to gender, education, I think income, a few other variables. And the ADHD population was split further into those who only had childhood ADHD. So these were called the ADHD D sisters, so 43 out of 70, whereas 27 of those with ADHD as children persisted in having ADHD as an adult. So not a huge population size for the study. The average age was just 28, and the average relationship duration was only 4 to 5 years, reflecting, again, this is a younger population and recruited via the internet. They report their own ADHD-ness was rated on a self-report scale, a well-validated scale that probably gives a fairly accurate ballpark estimation of ADHD severity. And they also rated their partner on an ADHD scale. And in case you're worried that people with ADHD aren't very good at rating the ADHD-ness of others, at least a few studies suggest that they do so with reasonable accuracy. So one of the big findings that jumped out was that the vast majority of people with persistent ADHD had partners that had substantial ADHD traits. So if we look at inattentive traits in your partner, the controls only reported about 5% of their partners had inattentive ADHD traits. The people who had childhood ADHD that ended in childhood had about 9% of them had partners with inattentive symptoms. So you'd say that's twice as high. Maybe there's some evidence that these kids with ADHD were still seeking out ADHD partners, even though their own ADHD was better. But then there was a whopping increase. So of the people with ADHD persisting into adulthood, 56%, so well over half, had partners with inattentive ADHD symptoms. So again, from 5 in the controls, 9 in the desisters of the childhood only versus 56 with child and adult ADHD, we see substantial increase. And in some ways, that's saying that the simple picture of being lumped with your fellow ADDers in childhood is why you find an ADHD partner can't be the whole picture, because then you would expect somewhat similar pictures between the ADHD, those who outgrew it and those who continued to have it. So it's at the very least continuing to have ADHD symptoms as well as being an outcast when you were at a younger age. And again, that doesn't mean all people with ADHD are treated as outcasts or feel like outcasts. Now, in that same study, not just inattentive symptoms, if we looked at hyperactive and or impulsive symptoms, a similar pattern, even more dramatic, was found. So the controls said 9% of their partners had some hyperactive impulsive symptoms. Among those with childhood-only ADHD, it increased somewhat to about 16% said their partners had some hyperactive or impulsive symptoms. But if you looked at those who continue to have ADHD, 81% of their partners had significant hyperactivity or impulsivity. And if you look at combined, whether the partner had at least 4 or more signs of either inattentive or hyperactive impulsive ADHD, so any symptomatology, the controls reported about 14% of their partners had some substantial, again, at least 4 symptoms of ADHD. The ADHD in childhood only said about 21% of their partners had this, but of the ADHD persisters, and so adulthood ADHD, adult or child and adulthood, 93% of them had partners with at least 4 ongoing ADHD symptoms. So this study, again, not huge. It's sort of a volunteer study, so self-recruited. They did screen out for people who seem to give statistically unreliable answers on some of the ADHD screeners. So it wasn't everyone who applied got into this study. They also remarked that because they matched the controls based on educational attainment, and people with ADHD tend to achieve go less far in school, that there might have been even more striking differences if their control population was more representative of the population at large. So that, again, would only have strengthened probably this association. So then they went further with this study and looked at certain behaviors which have been noted to be more common in individuals with ADHD. So rates of partner abuse, either being the victim or perpetrator, substance abuse, and financial problems, all correlated with ADHD, all correlated with likelihood of relationships not going well, and look to see whether these problems were prevalent in any of these couples or what the ratios were. And for the purpose, so the control groups looked very similar to those who had only childhood ADHD and a partner with no ADHD. They also looked at a sort of a middle group, which was the people with ADHD that went away by adulthood, and the controls who had both of those who had partners with ADHD. And then the third group was the people who had ongoing persistent ADHD, and again, almost all of those had partners with ADHD. And what they found is there was a dramatic difference between the people with persisting ADHD, again, most of those who had partners with ADHD versus everyone else, and the rates of psychologically abusing your partner were twice as high as in the control group. Rates of being the victim of psychological abuse were twice as high. Rates of physical, either being the perpetrator or being the victim of physical violence. And part of it was that the numbers were so low in the control population, but here they're 6 times higher for either being the perpetrator or victim of physical violence in your relationship. And a twofold higher rate of having financial difficulties. So all of those tracked with having an adult with ADHD, persistent ADHD, and having a partner with ADHD, so the two together. Interestingly, the substance abuse tracked a little differently, so that correlated most strongly with either partner, not both, so either partner having ongoing ADHD symptoms. So that showed a different pattern. But overall, this provides some evidence of both assortative mating and of significant problems that are more likely, and again, are harmful to the individuals and harmful to the longevity of the relationship when ADHD individuals mate or partner with other ADHD individuals. Again, that doesn't mean all ADHD pairings are bad. It just means there's an increased risk here. So that same research group had at least one other study mostly focused on cognitive behavioral techniques for couples where at least one person had ADHD. And they found in that other study that if one person in the relationship had ADHD, up to 67% of the time, both people had ADHD. Again, not necessarily a random sampling of individuals with ADHD, but again, some weak evidence for assortative mating. So what other evidence is there? There's a study going back to 2016 where they looked at 11 major psychiatric diagnoses, and they also compared it to 5 different physical health conditions: type 1 and type 2 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, and they looked at evidence for assortative mating. This was using a Swedish population database. So they were just looking at, is there a diagnosis recorded for this individual and for their partner? And the big findings they found was that regarding physical conditions, there was no evidence for assortative mating. So people with diabetes did not tend to marry other diabetics. However, with the psychiatric conditions, there was both a general factor, so having any psychiatric condition made it more likely your partner would have a condition as well, and that for each of the individual conditions, there was a specific effect, so that if you had depression, you were at least a little more likely to find a depressed partner. But there were 3 conditions that jumped out as having, if you had schizophrenia, you were something like, or if you had ADHD, you were more than 7 times likely in the general population to choose a partner with ADHD. So some of this, they point out that the conditions that were most likely to show assortative mating were, again, ADHD, autism, and schizophrenia, all of which have at least some likelihood of showing up during childhood. So there's some support for the theory that it's being an outcast, it's being considered different, may make you more prone or attractive to people you perceive to be like yourself as a partner. So there's also some evidence against much of a strong assortative mating effect, and that comes from, and these were not studies specifically designed to rule out assortative mating, but it was looking at polygenic predictive scores. So looking at the whole genome, looking at the genetic variability, and we can look at different variations in each allele in the gene and see how well they predict whether someone's going to have ADHD or depression or develop diabetes or some other condition. So these are polygenic risk scores, and 2 different studies were examining the issue of if there are substantial differences in the polygenic risk score between when you're looking at within families versus when you're looking between families. If there's a big difference in the strength of the predictability from those scores, it suggests that there's some strong family issues that may be confusing what's going on. And one of those could be assortative mating. And so those would be what are called passive gene environment correlations. But both studies, and again, this is not their primary goal, found that the polygenic risk scores within families and between families were very similar to each other, suggesting that there's minimal assortative mating on the basis of ADHD, at least, and these were very large population studies. The possibility, though, is, again, if you have substantial number who are assortatively mating, so seeking out fellow people with ADHD, but you also have a sizable group who are looking for the opposite, that may be why that may have confounded their results. So what's the evidence of disassortative mating? And again, this isn't even a published study. It's material from Gina Perez, who is at UMere, adult ADHD, and has a wonderful blog about ADHD factors, and has conducted over the years a study of ADHD partner survey, and some of this is from her website. So she asked the question of what traits attracted you to your ADHD partner, and with endorsement of over 70 to 80%, there were 4 factors that spouses of people with ADHD said they were attracted to. The person with ADHD is spontaneous or fun to be with, humorous or cheerful, interesting, imaginative or different, and attractive or sexy. And at least with 2 of those, the spontaneity and the interesting, imaginative, different, there was a substantial difference in terms of how people tended to rate them, that they were lower than their ADHD partner, suggesting that they were seeking out someone different. And at the other end of the spectrum, what were the traits that didn't attract you to your ADHD partner? So these all got less than 20% endorsement. Was being a good money manager, having a healthy lifestyle, and being responsible, mature, adult, organized. So in all of these people rated their non-ADHD partner as less than 20% likely to be good in any of these categories, but were substantially better themselves, again, suggesting a disassortative mating, that they were looking for or settling, or it worked out that someone different was going to be there. And then when they looked at sort of not the obverse question, but which of your own traits attracted your ADHD partner. So it was having the partners of people with ADHD make an assumption about what they thought the person with ADHD was seeking in them. The 4 top variables, all with more than 75% endorsement, were 1, a loyalty, truthful, sincerity measure, a warm, nurturing, unselfish, thoughtful and considerate, and an understanding variable. And in all 4 of these, again, the people assess themselves as their partner seeking, their ADHD partner seeking this, and that their ADHD partner not being particularly high in these regards themselves. So the data, the science is really weak, but I think there is suggestive evidence that there's both assortative and disassortative mating going on. I do think it's still important to treat each couple as a unique coupledom and each person as a unique individual, but to be aware, and from the research point of view, if you're not aware that when you're looking, often we look at what's the likelihood of marriages enduring, what's the likelihood of X, Y, or Z variable happening if you have ADHD, and if we're not taking into account the fact that we're overrepresented with partners who have ADHD, then that may skew some interpretations of results. I think this is important also in terms of those risk factors mentioned above, domestic partner violence, financial problems, substance abuse, that those are more likely to be problems or issues, again, when 2 people with ADHD are making the coupledom. And there's certainly implications for children. So we know having children who have ADHD themselves are likely to go less far in the educational system, but also just having a parent with ADHD is a predictor for a kid not going as far in school, whether or not that's a unilaterally positive thing to want. Presumably, it's certainly correlated with good outcomes. But actually having two parents with ADHD substantially further impedes the likelihood of good educational outcomes. So that's about all I have to say. This is a topic that certainly merits further research, and I see there are some questions, so I will jump to them. So hi Dennis asks, what's the difference between an MBBS psychiatrist and an MD psychiatrist? Is it that the MD is a research degree while the MBBS is meant for clinical practice? So I'm actually not even aware what MBBS is. So in the United States, and certainly different countries can do things differently, a medical doctor has gone usually to 4 years of undergraduate, then gets into medical school, which is 4 years, and then specializes in psychiatry. Currently, a psychiatry residency is 4 years, and usually you're not considered a surgeon or an endocrinologist or a psychiatrist until you've finished your residency, although you do have your medical degree, and most states actually would allow you to practice. Most entities wouldn't hire you without doing a residency. So in the US, there's no research requirement with an MD degree. It's just 4 years of medical school. Usually it's 2 years of, they're mixing it up more, of basic science, chemistry, biochemistry, anatomy, physiology, and 2 years of clinical working with actual live breathing humans. So in the US, the question I get often faced much more with is, what's the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist? And a psychologist hasn't gone to medical school, so doesn't have any particular training about the body. There's much more uniformity to the criteria for medical school training and the courses required than there is to training to get a psychology PhD. And you can get a PhD in psychology being basically clinically oriented or being basically research oriented, but there's much more variability program to program. Usually those are at least 3 or 4 year programs beyond an undergraduate degree. So maybe I overtalked that answer. So hello again, Mr. AKA 1996. Pretty much everyone with ADHD has rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Apparently, alpha-2 agonists and MAOI can help. Can you comment on this issue, success rates of different drugs, etc.? Who's a good doggy? Yeah, so that's Mr. Cupcake there, because people thought he was a girl if we just call him Cupcake. So I do have a talk on rejection-sensitive dysphoria. It's one of the earlier ones, so it's way, way back. First of all, there's one researcher, or he's mostly a clinician, who's strongly promulgated the idea that everyone with ADHD has rejection-sensitive dysphoria. And in his different writings, there's often blurring between rejection-sensitive dysphoria and just emotional volatility that could be associated with, which does seem to be associated with ADHD. I strongly object to the notion that most or almost everyone with ADHD has rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Particularly, we know there's something called positive illusory bias, which a third of at least boys with ADHD show, where it's almost the opposite of rejection-sensitive dysphoria. It's that they overrate their abilities. They overrate them even when confronted with evidence of when they're messing up. They're sort of overly optimistic and impervious. And I've certainly seen many individuals who are, inordinately happy and can let things slide off their back and move on without being troubled by rejection-sensitive dysphoria. The other thing I object to is linking this solely with as a feature or characteristic of ADHD. So I think there are many neurotypical people. I mean, having grown up, I hope I've grown up. I still am a gay man, but certainly many people, particularly who maybe hopefully less so now, but I think that the rejection sensitive dysphoria has as much to do with feeling substantially different and potentially even rejected by your family or micro culture. And the claims that MAO inhibitors or maybe guanfacine or something else are specifically helpful as opposed to other mood or anxiety agents, I have not seen any rigorous studies whatsoever. That doesn't mean they may not be particularly helpful or successful. I've certainly seen people with what would be called rejection sensitive dysphoria who did perfectly well with an SSRI. So I certainly have worked with others who guanfacine was helpful. I've also seen people who's treating the ADHD with stimulants seem to be very helpful for the rejection sensitive dysphoria. And there is some evidence that, again, the emotional volatility that at least 2/3 of people with ADHD seem to have, and particularly associated with hyperactive impulsive ADHD, does seem, at least in a few studies, I think Barclay was involved with both of them that I'm aware of. Those symptomatology is reduced by stimulant medication. So yeah, so Dennis is following up, and I know the educational system. I mean, even the college and high school are different in the U.S. I mean, essentially, the Europeans are ahead of us by the time we're graduating from high school. They've had slightly more in-depth education, and so even where they're at when they're about to enter college in general is slightly different than the U.S. system. And unfortunately, I'm not going to try to pronounce your whole name. I'll just say Q is asking, I'm taking 120 milligrams of atomoxetine Strattera per day, and his blood pressure is under control with medications. I'm not seeing any more to the question. I don't know if it's asking whether this is an excessive dose. My answer, and I have a specific one where I'm talking about stimulant dosing, and my big message is do not freak out or focus particularly on the numbers. I mean, yes, it may give you some general indication, but we know with every single drug out there that recommended dosage range is recommended for the normal, the average. And we know there's lots of human variation and variability. There will be some people who, at 1 or 2 standard deviations, will respond to the drug. We know that there's some people who will need going 1 or 2 standard deviations above the drug. Some of this is absorption, some of this is potentially receptor density, some of it is how quickly your liver enzymes are metabolizing or chewing up the drug. Yeah, so and I would say with genomic testing, unless they're also doing epigenetic testing, yes, it's useful to know what version of a enzyme your liver has for chewing up a specific type of drug, but unless we know how much of that specific enzyme is being made, which form or variant you have may be completely irrelevant. If you're not making any of it because that gene is silenced, then who cares? If you're hyperproducing it, even though you have a weak or less efficient version, you may be doing quite well. So I think there's lots of overinterpretation and misinterpretation of some of the genetic testing is my hobby horse there. I'm not seeing any other. So the question Q asked is whether he could take methylphenidate in combination with atomoxetine. So there are certainly, just statistically looking at prescribing records, many people who are on both atomoxetine as well as a stimulant, methylphenidate or Adderall, the two together does make it even more likely that blood pressure might be elevated. But if that's well controlled, then fine. Whether it increases the rates of other side effects, probably some dry mouth urinary issues are a little more likely. But again, I would focus on what is it doing for you, both good and bad. If your body seems to tolerate it, and that's what seems to be required, it's likely that you're getting away with a lower dose of stimulant because of the presence of the atomoxetine. So, Vitamin Don Bosco asks, with regards to dating, I'm currently seeing someone who is complimentary of me. She doesn't have ADHD. She provides a sense of calm. Why is this so? I mean, hopefully there's other specific things to your relationship that are positive and reassuring and fulfilling and wonderful that I know nothing about. But the claim is, and there's good evidence that people with ADHD are bad at creating their own structure, both on a time and space sense in terms of getting things done, and that's a major source of anxiety. Just having someone who likes and appreciates you can contribute to a sense of calmness, but sort of the complementariness of taking care of some of the tasks that you no longer have to worry about whether you're getting right or not, because there's someone there who has your best interests and is trying to help get things done, can be quite calming. And Mr. AKA 1996 is asking whether there's dexedrine shortages there in the US. And Canada's still having shortages. So I'm still seeing Vyvanse with this lisdexamphetamine. I'm still seeing Adderall shortages. I'm still seeing methylphenidate, particularly Concerta shortages. Maybe not quite as bad as 6 months ago, but still going on. In terms of dexedrine specifically, I don't know that I've run across a problem in the last 6 months, but I don't have large numbers of people right now taking it. So the press keeps blaming the increased rates of prescribing these substances, and that's certainly part of the problem. But the major problem has been a lack of supply, not an increased demand. That the companies in the US did not fulfill their quotas that they committed to providing. And as the DEA screwed up some, the DEA has relaxed or increased some of those quotas, so that should help the situation. The DEA also micromanages the flow to different pharmacies and tries to take into account the historical prescribing of each substance at each pharmacy and how much stock they have on hand and what the supply chains are doing, and tries to maximize the flow. But clearly there have been problems in that approach, and that also leads to frustration and why the pharmacies can't often tell you when they're getting more. Some of it's not just their suppliers, but the DEA does have some effect on the routing of it. So OC thanks me for the body-focused repetitive behaviors video. So you're welcome. And Vitamin is just thanking me for the comment about the relationship issues. So I'm not seeing new questions coming in. I'm double checking. Next week is a more broad topic. It's a more broad topic, the mental illness topic, and that is, or mental health disorder condition. Whether there's just one big condition or whether we should keep identifying 400, 600 separate little independent conditions. Okay, I see one new one has come in. Memento Mori says he got prescribed Vyvanse for the first time since he was a child. The insurance company wanted him to take Adderall XR. Why would the insurance want to tell me what to take? Shouldn't that be the doctor's job? That's a more political question than a pharmaceutical question, but clearly in America, so these are my political views, but I think they're substantiated by fact. The medical system for at least the last 20 plus years has been run by the insurance companies. It's not run by the doctors. It's not run by the hospitals. It's not run by the pharmaceutical companies. All of those have some interest and some stake, but it's clearly controlled and run by the medical insurance company. Part of why we keep seeing escalating rates is the insurance companies overall don't have any desire to control rates because they are skimming a percentage off the top. So more money keeps flowing into the medical world, the more profits they're making, and the more they can justify having realms of paper pushers, the more they can justify having big salaries at the top of the heap. On the other hand, they want to save as much money for themselves and not give it to the insurance companies or the doctors. So generally, most of the decisions as to what's tiered or what's preferred are largely financial decisions rather than showing what works well for patients or what even reduces medical costs in the long run, because there's numerous situations where a slightly more costly drug with better results would result in better functioning and less healthcare costs in the long run. But the whole American economy is not focused for the long run. It's focused for what's our bottom line right now and how much can we make stockholders happy for the next quarter. So Q asks again. Yeah, so Q is saying that even at the large, it's not, I would say, huge, but it's at the high end of the dosage range. He's having negligible, barely any side effects. So again, I would say what's more important is both for he and I'm assuming he and the doctor to document that these are the results I'm getting in terms of benefit, and these are I'm not having blood pressure issues, I'm not feeling anxious, I'm not having trouble sleeping at night, I have a decent appetite, and that means the dosage is in the right range for you. So stay healthy, stay happy, and I will be back next week. Good night.